that have been coming in, but very excited about that. All right, so last slide from me. Who is Scrum.org? Scrum.org is a global organization. We are focused on helping people and teams solve complex problems. Hence, we have conversations like these. We're founded by Ken Schwaber. And we focus on training, education, and community and certification. So I think that's it. I'd really love to get this started. Nigel's not going to talk too fast. Dave's not going to use too big of a words. But if they do, we will see all your comments in the box, and I will be, again, looking at your Q&A and presenting also questions of my own. All right, take it ahead, gentlemen.
Thanks, Patricia. And I'm going to let Dave just say a couple of words about introduction while you scan his QR code and mine, Dave.
Yeah, just to say hello. This is actually, for me, the culmination of a 25-year journey. So it's really exciting to be here.
Awesome. And for those that don't know me, I do these things about flow, and Dave and I have been colleagues and friends for a few years now, and I'm really proud and excited to present what we are calling Hexi. So without further ado, I've partnered with some PSTs from the Scrum.org organization. I'm proud to still be a PST within that organization. And I want to particularly call out John Coleman and Ralph Yockham, who have been two fantastic PSTs doing some amazing heavy lifting in the last few weeks to get this product ready. We've had great support from Martin Hinchelwood, Simon Arendo, and Jesse Hoovig, sorry, Jesse. And Kristen from Scrum.org has been helping a great deal with the artwork. So really big thanks and kudos to those. We wouldn't be here today if that hadn't happened. So what is Hexi? Well, this is Hexi. It's a new approach using physical artifacts, the things you see on these photographs, some carded hexagons and some plexiglass or acrylic hexagons, which are transparent. And they're designed to consolidate methods, approaches, tools, techniques, etc., that can be decomposed and recombined and applied to real-world organizational issues. So we're going to get a little bit of an explanation of what we mean by that decomposition and recombination. But first, so you know, these are the organizations that are currently engaged and involved. More are joining all the time. My own organization, the Flow System from the Flow Consortium, is a key collaborator and partner. Of course, Dave's organization, the Connevin Companies, the originators, Scrum.org, as you're learning today, Ivor Jacobson and Ivor Jacobson International with their product Essence and Essence Workbench are now collaborating to look at digitizing the hexes and presenting their material as Hexi as well, and we welcome them as a significant partner. Comic Agile, I'm sure you're all aware of who Comic Agile are. They make some fantastic cartoons. We'll be showing you some of their hexes in this presentation. And then the old DSDM network, which is now known as the Agile Business Consortium, Agile 42, Matthew Skelton and Manuel Diaz's work on team topologies, and Gaping Void. They're all now actively participating in creating content for this mechanism, this platform known as Hexi. So let's talk a bit about why. We have some distress in the current state of Agile at the moment. We've got mass layoffs. You're all reading about that. A lot of people I know, colleagues in the Agile world, who are Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, and unrelated roles, are really finding it tough within the current market. We've had a problem. I think the Agile industry has to take ownership of this, which has been creating this certification business. A lot of Agile became about selling training and certifications, not about presenting skills and solutions and ways forward for the organizations that were seeking to solve new challenges. And that's in some part what Hexi is hoping to address. Then there's a talk I gave last year and work by Professor David Graeber on what we call BS jobs. I'm using the polite version here, but the graphic will give you the idea. And they're roles which have been created by organizations like Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, and others, but have not been allowed to fulfill those roles as designed. And then the role itself becomes BS. And I think that's what's led to a lot of the mass layoffs of recent. And then we've got some responsibility ourselves, which is the theoretical Scrum Master. We can teach Scrummers in the guide, but when we want to stretch ourselves beyond that, there's a whole world of new methods, tools, techniques, approaches in complexity which need to be learned and understood. And that's what Hexi is going to help you with. when we start to talk about complexity, tools have context. A hammer and a toothbrush are both great tools, but they have limited utility. And if you get them mixed up, you can sort of probably figure out the end result. And this leads us to the concept of bounded applicability, which simply states that any method or tool has limits, and those limits are context specific. If you're using the established approach more furiously, more energetically, but don't get any better results, you've reached the boundary of that utility. So that's bounded applicability. And I often say you might not understand the work, so you need to learn more about the environment you're in, or you might just be using the wrong tools in the environment you're in. And that brings us on to what a complex adaptive system is. And one of my favorite phrases is, if you're not sure what a complex adaptive system is, look in the mirror. And what's staring back at you is a complex adaptive system. We as humans are complex. And when we get together and start interacting, it is a complex adaptive system. And complex systems scale by decomposition to what we call the lowest level of coherent granularity, and then through recombination. And we don't scale by imitation or replication through what's known as case-based studies. It worked here, so of course it will work there. We did Scrum in a hospital, so now we're in a law firm. It must work the same way. That's a case-based approach. And these complex adaptive systems are dynamic, continuously learning and adapting to external forces, changes, influences, and they're constantly emerging into new states to meet new, unique environmental needs. Now, the point about that is that if that's happening, you need to be able to assemble methods and tools and approaches to meet how the complex system is changing. We'll get a little bit more into this in the Q&A section. And maybe some of you are staring at the screen and going, what is this guy talking about? What does he mean, lowest level of coherent what? So here's a few of the examples to give you a taster for what's coming up on the Hexis that's been produced by the PSTs for Scrum.org or with Scrum.org. And what Dave told me the other day, and this was a great line we added to this slide, it's the granularity at which people can make sense of things without specific technical knowledge. And if you're facilitating a session or you're talking to different people with different levels of understanding, you need to be able to present it in a way that they can understand it without having the deep technical knowledge within that particular practice. And so then we're talking about chefs, not recipes. We know the Scrum Guide is this thing we all refer to. And within the world of frameworks, we've got very fixed recipes, people wrongly calling events ceremonies and having requirements out there. And then often people, I've seen them with talking sticks, passing the baton around at daily scrums, telling people when they can and can't talk. But complex adaptive systems require chefs, not recipe book users, adapting to local context and combining those core ingredients in different ways, as Dave told me the other day, to feed people. This is a core principle within Hexi itself, not a one-size-fits-all, not a recipe. So this is the format we're introducing with Hexi. This is one of the Scrum.org cards. You'll see increment is well known. So on the front of the card, you have a descriptor of what category it fits. In this case, the increment, and it's a measure because an increment is a measure of the value delivered. That's why we've used the term measure. Within Hexi, there are certain categories, and I'll show you those on the next slide. But essentially, we've got the increment as an example here. We've got some ratings on the front. What's the cost to using this to the organization? What are the skills necessary to be able to use this approach? And what level of engagement is necessary from the people participating to be able to be effective with this approach? On the rear of the card, you'll see a longer description, and you'll also see a QR code. And even if you went ahead and scanned that now, it'll take you to the appropriate Scrum.org website page where you can read more about what an increment is if you wanted to use this method. It's open source, multi-vendor, multi-method with high credibility on each component. Only the originators of methods and approaches are being allowed to contribute to this ecosystem. So I couldn't go and design the Scrum.org things on my own and take credit because Scrum.org is the home of Scrum. and therefore they are the people supporting this. They're not trivial, they're not oversimplified cards. As I say, those QR codes will link you to the originators of those practices. And when you read the cards, as you'll get the opportunity when you get the slide deck after this webinar, you will be able to see that where we've called an increment and measure, we've still referred to what Scrum calls it within the Scrum Guide, in this case, an artifact. So we are still not moving away from those definitions internally. So there are 10 types or categories of Hexi. I won't read them out. They're on the screen. An assembly is a collection of various combinations of other types of Hexi. And then there are different types in there, including frameworks. So we retain the word framework for people who are looking at frameworks. And if you look on this slide right in the middle, you've got the definition of Scrum as a framework. And then some of the other Hexis shown. We've got roles and accountabilities within a Hexi, accountabilities to support the definition in the Scrum Guide. So we have the Scrum Master accountability there, where we've got stakeholders, and we've added in some cards we think are valuable because stakeholders are valuable for Scrum. We have it as a role. And then we've got some of the principles and behaviors that come out of Scrum, for instance, courage, one of the values within Scrum. And then you'll see the sprint backlog is defined as a tool. We do describe on the Hexi what it is in the Scrum Guide, but the categories we have available for Hexi puts that in the category of tool. The sprint backlog performs a function and can be used as a tool in abstraction in other approaches. There are then some transparent Hexes, and I'll show you a picture of those in a moment. These are just representations. My own contribution, we've delivered 8 transparencies, which come from the Toyota Production System Lean world. So things like continuous improvement, respect for people, customer first. And these things can be played on top, adjacent, or across the main Hexes, and they change the direction or the energy gradient or give different emphasis to the things we're working on. And you'll see those in the case study shortly. And then Dave's company, the Kanban company, have delivered 8 standard transparencies, and these will come in sets with a quantity of them, and you'll be able to buy additional ones if you want to use them. And these give you different functions. And again, you'll see those in the case studies I'll present for you shortly. And these are the standard transparencies, acrylics, the plexiglass, whatever you want to call them, depending where you're from, that are delivered. We have 5 on the left, which are the things that change the energy gradient or perhaps tell us to stop or consider things, or the links when we link different practices. And again, I'll show you that shortly in the case study. And then there are 3 colored transparencies, and these are much smaller than the standard Hexi cards, and they indicate some sort of action or work or process that's happening when we interlock some of these Hexes, as you will see very shortly. So one of the key thrusts or constructs of this is to get away from this concept of universality. We've all seen the big frameworks with the big pictures with a multitude of tools slapped on them, and then we can apparently apply this in any particular use case across any landscape, across any organizational construct, and it should work exactly the same. That's universality. And a lot of Agile frameworks are built on this concept of universality. But just because your tool works does not mean it's the best tool. So we're moving away from this concept of universality and this one size fits all. And sometimes, even if you're using the wrong tool, you may get a result that's okay, but that's occurring more accidentally, not because you're using the right tool. And so context is key. And I'll try and step through this carefully so we understand this. But complex environments are dynamic in nature. Cause and effect relationships can only be deduced in retrospect. And let me explain what that means. So we need to start from where you are. You map the current dispositional state, the current state of the culture, and look for patterns. So where is the organization now? What are the patterns that we can see? And we use some techniques called sense making to help us with that. Set a vector, and if you're a lean person, I'll show you what that means on the next slide. Set a vector, a direction of travel, a direction to move in. What do we amplify, the things that are good? What do we want to dampen, the things that are not so good? Look for adjacent possibles, the things in your peripheral vision that you may be missing with something called inattentional blindness. What's the first step we can take in that direction of travel? Design interventions, small nudges. There's some work out there called nudge theory. There's a lot of information on Dave's website, which you had the QR code for earlier in the presentation. So design those nudges, those little nudges of the system in order to encourage that behavioral change, and then run multiple parallel safe to fail experiments, something we do in Scrum all the time. Then continuously monitor to determine any shift in the direction. Are we having the desired results? We can use techniques like sense making to help us review and understand whether those nudges are actually resulting in the changes we actually desire or want. And then monitor for weak signals, those things we might be missing, which help guide our direction. And when we talk about a sense of direction, we're often focused on the forward direction, what's in front of us, the future, the plan, the milestones, the targets that have been set by leadership or management. But what are we missing in our periphery? Can we step to the sides? Is there something that we're not seeing that we should be observing? Sometimes we should probably move to the foreground, go back, something we call backcasting here, look at something that went before, and to decide whether we're actually moving in the right direction. And those adjacent possibles, we call this side casting. So it's a matter of looking around you, thinking about the direction of travel, and looking where we can move for the next step. Now, I said if you're a lean person, that's Nigel. I'm a TPS Toyota guy. I give credit to the Lean Institute for this image, and I stuck a little bit of the PDCA on there. But if you look at what they teach, the previous slide was describing something called the vector theory of change, something that Dave's organization teaches and is an authority on. But when you look at it from a lean perspective, we often talk about true north or the ultimate goal. So we set the direction or challenge. What's the direction we want to move in? Then we go to the beginning, we understand the current situation, we make sense of where we are. Then we conduct experiments because we've established our next target condition. That's our direction of travel. We've grasped the current situation, established the next target, and then we're conducting those multiple safe to fail experiments. We're looking around us and understanding what can we do next to prove a hypothesis or to move us forward. And then we re-examine and repeat this. And Toyota Kata people will also be very familiar with this way of working. And again, case-based approaches don't apply here. You can't just copy something somebody else has done and just apply it in your unique situation. So for a bit of fun, there's a video on the internet, and Dave told me about it, and I didn't even know it was there, and it's been out for years, and it's very popular. It's called Hexagons Are the Bestagons. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of information why we chose hexagons for this. There's this word called tessellation. Hexagon-shaped artifacts or figures are capable of being composed into complicated configurations and decomposed back to their initial form. I promise you I didn't write these things. These are things that exist in the peer-reviewed literature. Hexi, the product we're showing you today, takes advantage of this concept of tessellation, an arrangement of shapes closely fitted together, especially of polygons. So squares and triangles will also do the same, but there's a reason hexagons are better. You get no gaps and no overlapping, of course, with a shape that can tessellate. Hexagons best fill a flat surface with no wasted space and have the highest stability in terms of surface tension. So that's a little bit of why we chose hexagons. But then Dave and I started having a little bit of fun leading up when we were planning the content of this. And Dave, as you know, is known for having an elaborate vocabulary, and he'll tell me off after I've stopped talking. But we got out the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, and started doing some digging. So Hexi, the trademark of this product, is a pronoun. And so that started in 2023 when this came around, and we both had a lot of debate about whether the plural should be hexes or hexes. So we decided both are good. Both are okay. The one without the E is probably the more correct English, but I like the look of the one with the E. So we're going to use both. So apparently there's something called hexiology that came out as a noun from 1894, which is the branch of science which treats the development of behavior of living creatures as affected by its environment, and all flow systems are living systems. So that seems to fit. And then you've got polyhex from 1967. So when you start to bring hexes together It's called a polyhex, a planar shape formed by joining a number of identical regular hexagons by their edges. So when you start to landscape these, as you'll see in the next slide, you're forming a polyhex. And then we found this other word, hexagonize, from 1885, a verb. So if we take your methods, tools, techniques, approaches, and put them onto hexes, we are hexagonizing you, I guess, in that way. Anyway, I just thought I'd add that because I thought it was fun. So let's get into some use cases for this. Now you've got a bit of the preamble. So I put together some of these. Now remember, these are just the ravings of a madman putting these together. So I'm putting some examples of how you might play with these in a facilitated session. So you would bring together several teams. You may work on a problem. And this is an example of how these may play out. So first of all, I may place a card from the Conneving company, a Hexi, which is the basic Conneving Hexi, giving me 3 domains to understand, 3 states for me to understand where I am, ontological states or key domains. Am I in an ordered system, linear causality, where everything is predictable? Am I in chaos, where it's just random and unpredictable and just do something and hope for the best? Or am I in a complex domain where I can't predict causality and I need to use different tools to solve my challenge? In this case, I went ahead and said, hey, we're in a complex domain. So that's the first thing we've done. We've made sense of where we are. The next thing is we've then wanted to learn a little bit more about complex adaptive systems. So we've taken the Hexi card from the flow system partner set, and there's information about what a complex adaptive system is. And on the back, of course, remember the QR code, so the people in the session can then understand more about complexity and complex adaptive systems. We then decided, well, there's things we don't know we might need to know, but we're getting some murmurations in the system, and we call this weak signal detection. There's weak signals out there. We may have a sniff of what they are, but we want to understand them. So we've played the weak signal detection card, and then we've said we're going to need to do some sense making. There's an actual product called Sense Maker from the Conneving company, but there are a number of different techniques for sense making. And so in this case, we've decided to be able to help us understand where we are. We need to do some sense making. And we've chosen a technique called storytelling and narratives, which is where we ask the people in the system in a safe way to tell us their stories, their short narratives, to help inform us. And that's a key sense making technique. We've also determined we need to practice active listening, because we've realized, as I'm a victim of this, we're not so good at active listening. So somebody decided to draw attention to the fact we needed to do some active listening. And then we start to find that we're having some gut feel. We're having this logic of the hunches. So we play the abduction card, which indicates that we're doing some abductive reasoning, which means we're forming hypotheses without any real facts or observations, but just some gut feel. And that's prompted some questions from executives in the room. So we've placed the executive question. They're sort of postulating some ideas based on this abductive thinking. And we've got some stakeholders who we're conferring with. So with this stakeholder card now from Scrum.org is now being played. And I'm using another card here from the flow system about situational awareness, because we've got this abductive hypothesis. We're starting to ask some questions. We're talking to our stakeholders, and we're having to gain some awareness of the environment we're in, which is what we call situational awareness. I've put down the card here from Scrum.org, which is the focus value, because we really now need to start to focus and prioritize based upon our sense making and our discussions and our awareness. I've used a blank Hexi here because we're going to include some blank templates in the kits, so that if there's a practice or an approach or a method or just some advice that isn't present in the kit, you can write your own, which is an important part. So we've identified the training of teams in these discussions as a gap. So we've played the team training Hexi again from the flow system set. And because we're agile folks and we like to iterate, what I've actually created here is this iterative pattern. So you could actually now go around and around that, continuously refining, and then maybe go off in a different direction. Of course, real estate and use case level of context here is limited on the screen. So that's problem solving. Now let's look at a strategy one. And I'm going to introduce more hexes and some of the transparencies in this use case here. So let's say we start off with goal identification. We're focusing on strategy. So the first thing we're going to do is understand the desired outcome expected over a specific period of time. What's our strategy to achieve that? Well, the first thing I might do is do some Wardley mapping from Simon Wardley, a technique for us to look at the value chain, how close the things we are doing to the customer, and the evolution of our products and services over time, and understand where we are with those products and services, and start to make some decisions about where we should focus on building or buying or renting commodity. And we're using a transparency here because we want this to be very customer first focused, and Wardley mapping is a customer first focused approach. So we just played the transparency to show that. We then added risk management in here from the Kanban company set because there are some risks when we're looking at strategy, and that needs to be considered. So whilst we've done some understanding about products and services and where they're positioned and the development life cycle, we're also looking at the risks that are inherent. And that's triggered us to use a new technique from the Kanban company called estuarine mapping. Don't have the time to go into that in detail, but this starts to look at what is possible, what is not possible, and what can be made to be possible. It's a very high level summary of that, but I encourage you to read about that technique on the Kanban company wiki. And so now we're doing discovery. So now I've played the transparency over those three to show that those three are very well connected. We've got a customer first focus, and we're now in a discovery phase. We may spend a lot of time in this area before moving on. Because of time, we will move on. Now we've got this technique called refinement, this method from the Scrum framework and from Scrum.org, because we now need to start applying some refinement to what we've been working out, because we can't do everything all the time. And these things are linked. This transparent Hexi shows that the discovery phase and refinement are linked. And indeed, we could go backwards and forwards between them. Now we're playing a card called the definition of done. This gives us a very clear guideline to define criteria to say when we're done. So we've got this goal, we're doing this discovery, we're doing this refinement. We really need to know when we're done. And the definition of done is a practice that helps us understand and document what done looks like. And of course, with one of the lean system thinking transparencies from the flow system is the concept of elimination of waste. So we're trying to reduce the non-value added activity here. These are linked, and we can go backwards and forwards between them. And then from this, we may choose to do some parallel safe to fail probes. Safe to fail experiments may be another word for that, where we have multiple experiments running in parallel to determine the right solution. In lean circles in Toyota, we may call this set-based concurrent engineering or set-based design for those that are more familiar with those terminologies. And again, these are linked because our definition of done is determining what done looks like. Our safe to fail probes are based on what we've defined in the definition of done. Then we now start to make some decisions. So we're playing leaders' intent, stakeholders, and constraint management, and also decision making. These are all intrinsically linked. We want clear empowerment and psychologically safe decisions. Leaders need to provide intent. Stakeholders have influence there, but the people doing the work can be empowered to make some decisions, and decision making is very clear. But we have some constraints. We have some enabling constraints, which are the guardrails in which we work, and we may have some inhibiting constraints, the constraints that are rules and regulations that we can't step over. So we want to ensure everybody understands what a bias towards action means, which is really focusing on making decisions versus making decisions to be seen to be making decisions, something called action bias. All these are intrinsically linked. And then we may end up designing some micro nudges, some small interventions in the system. So that's a strategy case. And I put one on there because that's our action transparency, just to show we're taking key action in that area. I want to show you one that's to do with Scrum, and we've only got a couple of more slides to go, and then we'll hand over for Q&A. So let's say we want to do some backlog creation. we're looking at a new initiative, we're looking at some new ideas. And so the first thing we do is play the customer card, because guess what? We're all customer first focused, or should be. We've got some questions we want to answer. That's obvious. So we've got the executive question card and the stakeholder card from the Scrum.org deck, because we're involving stakeholder opinions. So we've got that customer first transparency just to remind us. We then may use something called entangled trios, which is a very powerful technique where we can take representatives from three very different areas of the business and bring them together to look at a problem. And that cognitive diversity helps us to understand things much more clearly, versus having the people who have got sort of bias towards what they're doing, because, you know, IT building solutions because they're IT, versus talking to the different people and representations in the business. So we've played the sense making card here because entangled trios helps us make sense. We've played a blank Hexi there. We might do some traditional gap analysis. That's a big thing in the lean world: current condition, target condition. And again, we may use the Wardley mapping technique. So here we're in discovery. Now we've got the product owner, because this is the concept from Scrum that allows us to start to think about how do we build a backlog for things with the developers, the people who are going to create the value. So we've actually got that, all that stuff at the beginning. Now we're getting into some Scrum practices. Of course, they're bi-directional. We go between the product owner and developers when we're building the backlog, and we're constantly in that state of refinement. So we play the refinement card. We've got the complementary practice, which most of us use within Scrum, which is acceptance criteria. We think this is very important and powerful, helps us define acceptance on individual items in the backlog. So how do we test that they're done, independent to the definition of done? Again, we're going backwards and forwards between these. This is not a fix. We're sort of iterating within this. And then again, we may start to run some safe to fail probes, because that's what Scrum is: small iterative experiments to understand, to progress forward. So this is one technique we might use to do backlog creation. Now, because and of course, I played the empiricism card because we want to be sure that what we're doing is being empirically tested, and we're using the aspects from Scrum of empiricism, transparency, inspection, adaptation, and there are separate cards for those three elements that can be used independently. Now, and of course, they're linked. So there's one here from Dave. I'm going to do the clicking for you, Dave, if you would like to open the mic and tell me. We're starting with anecdote circles. Please go ahead.
Okay, so Nigel's been giving you examples of using Hexi to construct a project or a program. You're about to engage in something. These we'll do in these sequences. There are a couple of other uses. The main use we used in IBM when I created this over 25 years ago was to actually test people at the end of training courses to see if they were chefs, not recipe book users. Could they assemble things in different sequences? This is us putting a new product together. So we're designing a product. We've got lots of things we could put together, and this allows us to have conversations and play with them. So we've long focused on narrative work. So we can have physical anecdote circles if you can click. Yeah. The other thing we're also focused on is whole of workforce engagement in scenario planning. So instead of having a sort of 3-month process, yeah, you can actually get everybody engaged. And we've also got a thing called mass sense, which is mass engagement. So what we decided to do is to put this together with Comic Agile. So this is a way of measuring Agile culture and having a bit of fun. So the way the product works is you basically pick one of those Agile cards, the Comic Agile cards, which represents the culture of your company. You then signify it, indicate it. We draw a map from that. And then you can nudge it. This is the more stories like this, fewer stories like this approach to change. So if you can say to people, we want more of these, fewer of those, also effectively gives you a vector. You can change the direction. Thing we're doing a lot now is sacred storybooks, particularly if people have been laid off. We just done a big one for BMW to capture their foundation stories, which are actually part of that. And then the big thing in development and other sectors is peer-to-peer knowledge flow without mediation. Now, the product is actually more coherent than that, but what we've done is to put those together in different sequences and say that's the project. And to give one example, Nigel in Flow System has got a card called CAS, yeah, Complex Adaptive Systems. We're CAS specialists. We actually don't have a card called CAS. We have other cards which are deeper than that, and that's part of the power of the technique. You can start high, you can go low, you can go backwards and forwards. So this is for project planning and also for testing at the end of training.
Okay, so a little quick one from Dave on that one, and we'll get it. I'm conscious of time, so there's only a couple of more slides to show you. Then we'll get into the doubtless dozens of questions. So these are some of the uses that we have been working on collectively in the Hexi community now. There'll be tons that we haven't thought of. We know they can be used to help rescue those big framework initiatives that have stagnated or gone off the rails or aren't delivering the values that people expected with that universality approach. So this helps us to decompose, recombine, find new ways to solve some of the challenges in those big framework initiatives. And we know you guys out there, when you start interacting with these, will have an immense lot of fun with them and find all sorts of different ways of using them. I even had a call with Australia last night with somebody who said, I've seen what you're doing. I've got all these ideas. And he showed me about 100 hexes on screen that he'd been sort of figuring out and trying to come up with some ideas. So just to wrap up this presentation part of the webinar, this is the initial pack from Scrum.org. I did count them last night. I think there's 32 cards in total. This is just the front side of them, just to show you what's been represented. You'll get these in the download of the PDF afterwards. And this is the second part of that. I couldn't get them all on one slide and make them visible. So it covers all the aspects, all the events, the accountabilities, the values, and all the other key principles, and those couple of extras we've put in, which we think are important, such as acceptance criteria, stakeholders, etc. So what's coming later? Well, I'm working on a full set with the Flow Consortium and the Flow system for lean thinking. They're in development now. They should be out very soon in the next month or two. We're just working on the visualization of them. I'm talking to the patterns community about a number for agile patterns and anti-patterns, so they will come forward. All sorts of cool stuff that I got shown in there yesterday. We're going to be working on complementary practices, so there'll be a second pack from Scrum.org or in collaboration with Scrum.org, which will be complementary practices, which we, things like estimating and velocity and probabilistic forecasting and all those things that will get you all hot and bothered. And then we're having conversations with the originators, people like Kent Beck's community, to talk about extreme programming, to bring out a set for XP, because we think there's a lot of really powerful things there. And for those that were talking on LinkedIn about the immutability of Scrum, let me share this with you to allay any fears. So immutable means not changing or unable to be changed. It's an adjective. So Scrum as a framework remains immutable because it says so in the Scrum Guide. And Ken writes the Scrum Guide, so it says so, and it will remain immutable. So Scrum as a framework is immutable, but a framework's a basic structure underlying a system concept or text. So Hexi brings optionality and evolution and enhances Scrum, also allowing Scrum to support other methods and approaches. So we add things to Scrum and Scrum adds things to other methods and approaches. And when we take Scrum apart, it isn't Scrum as defined in the Scrum Guide, but that's okay. So context determines our methods and approaches. And when decomposed, Scrum is no longer a framework. How can you get some of these? Scan the QR. You'll get this download afterwards, but take a note of that QR code and that address. There's going to be a pre-sale of 1,000 sets initially. You can register to be kept informed or for the pre-sale. And if you are a creator of an original source of a methodology or a set of practices and want to contribute towards Hexi, then go to that same page, get in touch, and then Dave and the gang will be in touch as to how you can contribute. And with that, I'll say thank you for the presentation portion. I will stop sharing my screen and we'll open up for questions and collaboration in the chat. Patricia.
Well done. Well done. I'm very impressed you were able to get that in, so thank you. Thank you for sharing all those. We have a lot of questions. Dave has also been answering some behind the scenes that make sense. So I'm actually going to start off high, and I'm looking at the different questions. So hopefully I'll get these in a nice pattern. But one of the questions, and Dave had answered this, was, do you have to start with the card understanding if you are in a complex complicated or obvious domain. And so the question here is, the answer is, he said no, that's the beauty of it. But how much do you think it is important to understand the domain so that you would understand, should we be using a lean approach, which primarily might be used in a certain way, and that would lead to a bucket of decisions and conversations, or something else?
Can I make 2 points on this? All right. One is, I've never liked it when people say Scrum or lean, and dependent on whether it's an advocate, we're complex, they're complicated. Actually, aspects of both are in both domains. I think there's this, oh, we'll be complex, then we're superior to these other guys, which is like stupid, right? So I don't buy that. Also, the value of the Hexi is you can start in different places. So, for example, we developed 3 methods which are designed to feed the Scrum backlog. There's no point in us trying to develop a competitor to Scrum. It's best in business in terms of what it does, but it assumes you can get a backlog in. So we develop methods and tools, for example, to map unarticulated needs or to bring people engaged on a wider level. And that becomes a different starting point. So you can put hexes around other sets of methods as well as within them. And the issue is, we don't always start with Canadians. Sometimes in our own construct, we often start with flexures, curves, or estuarine, and Canadian actually comes in right at the end, right? So there's no, this is a chef point. You have different ingredients. You know enough about the theory of taste. You can put them together in different combinations rather than being the sort of first year student at university who can only follow a recipe book. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So then let me bring this to the second thing that we've seen, and Nigel, you saw this a little bit on LinkedIn. So to back that up, what we've said is, you've said again and again, one size doesn't fit all. We've been saying that for decades. Why now do you think that it makes a point to use this type of approach versus staying with an Agile framework?
I think, a lot of us have been doing it in practice anyway for a period of time. I think that certainly in my own work, and the reason I did the flow system thing was back in Toyota, we used Scrum. We created Scrum the Toyota way. Scrum was a fundamental practice that we used within Toyota, but there was a whole bunch of other stuff we needed to do. We needed to add to Scrum. We had obviously the deep teaching from the Toyota production system and Toyota way, which didn't go away. We still use that. So Scrum was an important component in the work we were doing. And then people started to find that elements of Scrum needed some tweaks or changes to make it fit the context more effectively. So I think we'd been doing it. We started writing the books to explain what we'd been doing. And of course, Dave was doing all the research, as he's been doing for decades, on complexity thinking, complexity science. And then the Hexi idea started to be born. We included it in the flow system playbook because of the collaboration we're on with Dave. We just got that in the book earlier. But it was obvious we needed to move away from a lot of the really big hulking frameworks without, throwing anybody under the bus here.
Let me stop you there then, because that came up on LinkedIn, and that is one of the questions. One is, is this like safe? It looks like safe. It's got a big picture. We're making that big picture. And also, is it similar to disciplined Agile?
Dave, do you want to take the first bit, and I can add a comment to this. But
yeah, I remember the first time I saw the SAFE diagram, which was at a conference in Novi Sad. Yeah, many years ago, and I got really angry and wrote a very fast blog post called The Infantilization of Management, right? So if you look at the SAFE diagram, everything is in sequence or in control feeds. So it always looks to me like a sort of badly drawn diagram of a petrochemical work rather than something which is dynamic, right? What you need to be able to do is not do what SAFE did, which is take everybody else's methods and put them into a flow diagram. You need to be able to take those methods and put them together in different combinations and different sequences in different contexts. And that's the difference, all right? Also, this works at a lower level of granularity in terms of what happens. And yes, there are similarities with blades, and it would be very easy. For example, Ivor Jacobson stuff essence, we can bring across his stuff at practice level. Yeah, we could bring across blades from disciplined Agile the same way. The issue here is to be open in terms of the way we work.
Excellent. Okay, then let's move on to just a little bit more about the hexes then. So on one of the slides, Nigel, the first step was and this is a little bit, there were some steps about how would you get started. And it said, map the current dispositional state of the culture and look for patterns. And so one of the questions that came up is, let's talk about dispositional, what that actually means, but then how good is good enough when we're doing that? Because you could sit there for 2 years if you got the right consulting company in.
So, I mean, Dave's word is dispositional, but relating, I'm just looking at the exact definition so we can use something that the dictionary would say, but relating to natural tendency, whether a person or a thing, towards a particular conditional action. So when I start to the first thing I do whenever I engage with a client, for instance, is I go to Gemba. I go to where the work is being done. I spend time to understand the environment, the systems, the landscape, the people. That's sense making, but I'm doing it in person. And there are tools and techniques we've used effectively, like SenseMaker, to enable us to make sense of the current situation. The biggest challenge with a lot of organizations, and everybody on this webinar will nod their heads furiously, is people go out and buy a framework or a methodology or a system without actually first understanding where they are and where they want to get. And they just think they're buying a magical solution. They know they've got challenges. One of the things I often ask customers when I go is, what do you think the problem actually is? Because, they'll cite things like, customer or staff attrition, costs escalating, products not getting sold. And I tell them they're not problems. They're outcomes of the way they do what they do, the way they do the work. Your system is producing those outcomes. So if you want to change those outcomes, before you go buy an off-the-shelf framework, go and understand the dispositional state of the system, its interactions, its people, its complexities, etc., and then start and use there's tools in the set to help you do that, and then decide from that point what the direction of travel is and where you can move to actually move the system in the direction you want it to be moved in, which is why decomposing the elements we've been talking about and finding different and unique combinations. And the important thing for everybody to remember, as the system evolves, so will the tools and techniques you use, so will the methods and approaches you're applying. It isn't just, we know the state of the system now, let's apply these things and off we go for the next 5 years. A month later, a week later, a year later, things will have changed and you'll need to constantly revisit, which is why the concept of sense making is important, because you're constantly monitoring over a time horizon how the system's responding to those interventions and nudges. And none of the frameworks provide that capability. And as Dave says, fixed, prescriptive, do this, followed by that, followed by the other. And even to some degree, Scrum is prescriptive. You start at sprint planning, or maybe somebody would say we start at refinement. Then we've got our 5 key events or our 4 key events plus the sprint, the container, and then we rinse and repeat. So what we're saying here is occasionally we need to go off at a tangent and do something because the system demands that level of attention.
All right. And I remember when the 3 of us and my coworker, Kurt Bittner, had that conversation, because I said, well, Scrum is a bit linear, and aren't you breaking that? There's an input and an output. What does that mean? And I think the experimentation, depending on the system, is well heard. All right. So what you were expressing there, I think there's a lot of questions that are relevant to this, is that both of you have a lot of experience working with several different clients, and there's a lot of people here who are within the company. So when we're talking about just the notion of using the Hexis, and I imagine there's going to be something virtual, there's something that we're using physically to have these conversations, but I don't know what I don't know. So for instance, one of the use cases was around goal identification. I mean, how would I even know that I should be starting from goal identification? And then how would I know that the technique I would be using is wordly maps?
Dave.
Okay, so there are a couple of things here, and this will answer some of the other questions as well. If we're doing Hexi facilitation for real, and we've been doing this 20, 30 years, you actually end up with 2 wallpaper pasting tables. They're perfect size and they only cost $5, right? And what you do on one wallpaper pasted table, you lay out all of the Hexis which you think might be of relevance. And the other one is where people work. Now, the Hexis act as a memory trigger or as a curiosity point. So you will find people who walk down and say, I've forgotten about that. Because you know what it's like, you go on a training course, you only use 2 or 3 of the ideas. those are the only one you remember. So it acts as memory augmentation. Or they say, that sounds interesting. They scan the QR code and they can go to the wiki, which describes how the method works with detail and cases. So we found both of those in operation. Yeah, that's kind of like the physical aspect. I think the other thing is, and I think this is highly relevant to Scrum consultants at the moment, they're trying to move into the OD space. They're trying to move into the strategy space. We have OD, strategy, foresight, and change packs from specialists in those areas, which you can combine with a Scrum pack. So you can start to talk about integrating tighter into other departments, which things they'll recognize. So it allows that sort of migration. And the third thing is, if your company's undergoing a major change program, you can decide which hexes you want, and you can create your own hexes, and that created as a pack for your change agents. So there's lots of ways that we do this, but the physical, and somebody mentioned material engagement theory, which was really important. Yeah, basically the physical pack makes a big difference, because putting things around physically, walking, groups walking down both sides of a table, horizontal works better than vertical facilitation. Yeah, you're more likely to produce something which is going to produce a good result, yeah, than you are if you just take, oh, I know what I did last time, let's do it again. It sort of breaks that up.
Dave, if I could just stay with you. So on one of the use cases, the slide that you showed, there were some facilitation aid cards with Comic Agile, right? And said, hey, this reflects our culture. And that in the scope of this webinar is very easy. But how do you expect that, or how have you seen that be used in terms of, we don't agree? Is there a discuss card? Is there a veto card? Is there a big conversation?
You got those, and you can also, we got gaping void cards coming as well. If you look at our pack, for example, we've got quotes, from famous people. We've got sayings. Yeah, the idea is it's not just methods and tools, and we've got warnings. So the transparency hexes include a warning sign, which you can put on a method and say, when we get to that, we're going to stop and double check. So it allows a much more sophisticated conversation to take place than you would normally have.
Excellent. All right, let's get a little bit more.
I'm trying to answer questions as fast as I can in the Q&A box, but as best I can.
That's okay, because what we'll do is we'll try to get these questions, take a look at and respond to them in a post webinar if we can. But we have about 5 minutes left, so I think we can dive a little bit deeper. So we've been saying we a lot and you a lot. Who's playing the cards? Who's the we? What have been your experiences, and who do you think should be there?
Dave.
Well, I mean, there is the sort of open space type concept, is the people who turn up are the right people. Yeah. One of the ways you can use Hexi, which we've done several times now, is have different groups given the same problem and then see what hexes they assemble, take photographs, and then get people to have conversations. So sometimes you deliberately get people with the same problem and see how they assemble things in different sequences. And that is, by the way, a massive risk reduction method. When I was running software teams, when we did air traffic management control, for example, if we had critical software, we had 3 teams working parallel, without any contact with each other, because that made things safer. Yeah, and you did the wrong button there. Sure.
I didn't do anything, but I was celebrating, apparently.
So different things work in different combinations, all right? The idea is this is a physical augmentation. Yes, we will do it virtually as well, but it's not as powerful as physical. I can't overemphasize the memory jogging capacity of hexes. Yeah, the fact that you can, or the curiosity factor, well, hang on, let's try that, or we've forgotten that. That really is significant in terms of the way it actually works in practice. And as I say, you can actually construct kits just for a company. So they can say, well, we only have these methods approved and these suppliers. Yeah, and we've also got our own value statements. Well, fine. Hexi is an open platform. Anybody can feed us the data, we'll produce them. Yeah, we don't have to approve it. Yeah, so you can actually start to put together more limited kits for your own organization. And to some extent, this is a challenge to the big consultancies. We're trying to move away from the every 2 years a new recipe into, let's realize there was some stuff we did 20 years ago, which is still valid today. There's a lovely phrase we use, bricolage. So bricolage is picking things up and putting them together, including some things you've laid aside and didn't realize where there was significance. So Hexi is a bricolage technique. Yeah.
So I just want to jump in, if I may, Trish, because there's two things. A lot of people asking about digital platform. So there is a partnership with Ivor Jacobson and Essence. We're looking at opportunities there. We are in discussions about how we bring this forward to a digital thing. We want something more intelligent than just a simple mural board or Miro board with a bunch of shapes on it. We'd like something with a bit more interactivity, because when you bring certain things together, there's the possibility of having some intelligence that suggests things, talks about things, reveals more information, and helps us with emergence. So digital will be coming. Watch this space. We will be keeping you informed on that. But there's a question here I want to throw to Dave from Paul McTurk. Is Ashby's law of requisite variety a consideration in having a large number of hexes up your sleeve?
No, and I was trying to avoid that, because complexity theory basically invalidates Ashby's law of requisite variety, and he knows that, all right? So that's a provocative question. We can have that some other time. Hexi actually reduces your dependency on Ashby's law because of clustering and consolidation capacity. So the variety of response is actually less than the variety of the stimulation. And I know that will send a whole bunch of people in cybernetics insane, but you need to pay attention to it, all right?
Trish, we've got about 2 or 3 minutes. I'm going to throw it back to you in case you want to find the best way of using those last few minutes.
Oh, you're in trouble, Nigel. Okay, so.
No, we answer more questions. That's fine. I just didn't want to keep talking.
No, meaning this question's for you.
Oh.
So one of the questions that came in, and we had talked about, because this is Scrum.org, we're on a Scrum.org platform. And we both belong to Scrum.org. We have a Scrum.org friend with us. So one of the things that this question is about is, generally we've already talked about Scrum, we've talked about immutable. And what that means is that, yes, people can pick and choose what works for them. And I would argue that requires a strong understanding of Scrum, what that means in terms of value, what you're trying to do, right? We're not doing Scrum for the sake of it. But this is Scrum.org. So does this mean that Scrum.org, in your eyes, as a professional Scrum trainer, is advocating to help people and organizations deviate from Scrum?
Ooh, you would do that to me, wouldn't you?
Indeed, I would. And it's enough time just so I don't have to answer it.
I'm looking for Dave West or Ken in the audience. I'm panicking now. So somebody asked, are we going to teach this with Scrum? And I think some Scrum trainers definitely will teach this technique as an adjunct to Scrum. I think that Scrum, people see Scrum as this simple thing, but actually when you start to study it, as PSTs do and many members of the community do, you realize there's a lot more depth to Scrum than just following a simple framework, 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, etc. I think that Scrum has to grow. I think the Agile community as a whole has to grow, but from a Scrum.org perspective, I think Scrum has to grow, has to start looking at what its role is in organizational design, more of a focus on product development, more focus on product management, these types of things. And I think that Hexi will support and complement that, or these approaches will support and complement that. I think Scrum is safe as a framework. I think it works extremely well. It's a very, very substantive practice, but I've used it for, decade, 2 decades nearly now. It's used extensively in Toyota. It marries very closely to what the Toyota production system offers and produces. So I think from a point of view of Scrum as Scrum, I think it's secure and safe. If you think we can fix everything with just Scrum, we cannot. That's a wrong approach that people sometimes think. Scrum is a very effective technique, tool, practice, framework when used in the right context. Don't believe it can solve world hunger and solve world peace.
Thank you. So on that note, Dave, any ending comments that you would like to add?
No, I think one of the things I'm fascinated by in Hexi is it allows us to start to integrate software development with people management, with strategy, with foresight, with risk management. And no one vendor is going to own all the solutions in that space. So this is a way in which vendors can come together. And I think the one thing we are insisting is the originators of the method own their method cards unless they authorize somebody else to do it. I've had enough of people taking other people's methods and rebadging them and just selling training. We need to go back to that original developer concept.
All right. On that note, thank you very much. we're sorry we didn't get through all the questions, but I'm sure we'll find a way to share our thoughts, or Nigel and Dave will share their thoughts through social media or a podcast or something in the future. But thank you very much. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Nigel. Scrum on until next time.